Welcome everybody to this after lunch coma session on the big issue, I guess, on the issue of European global strategy or global strategy in general. It's very wise of the conference organizers to put this extremely high firepower panel right after lunch, when usually, of course, the attention curve and the overbriefing syndrome set in. And so we will be talking about the big issues, I guess, trying to provide the umbrella, the strategic umbrella, over many of these smaller things that we talked about today, small things like Russia, I guess, small things like enlargement and the future of NATO. Now we want to get even bigger in a sense and provide the general bird's eye view on this. And for this, we are very well equipped, I guess, with the people that are here on the panel. We have with us Emma Bonino, the Foreign Minister of Italy, of course, and the former Commissioner of the European Union. Joschka Fischer, all the way here on my right, former German Foreign Minister, of course, known to everybody. Steve Hadley, who spoke already this morning on another panel, so we're double dipping him, and I'm not going to introduce him once more. And then there's, of course, Minister Sikorski from Poland. And I think that is as good a lineup as one can get on these kinds of issues. European Global Strategy was a project that was also very heavily supported by the Polish government, a think tank exercise on trying to conquer new ground on the strategic debate in Europe. The results have been out. We are not going to be talking about the document, but we'll be talking about some of the issues that are in the document. And I would like to give the first intervention to Steve Hadley, who's the American guest, if you will, on this panel, and who in our quick pre-briefing already provided so much ammunition in when he told me what he was going to talk about, that I think we will have no shortage of topics to raise. We'll then take it from there. I think, Steve, please, you just go ahead, and then we'll go into the debate. Thank you.
I think it's terrific that we have an opportunity to talk about strategy, and particularly with this distinguished panel. Obviously, to have a sound global strategy, you have to start with a vision of the world in which your strategy is going to operate. And that is really, what is the vision for the world over the next 10 to 15 years? And I think it's important to start there, because I think when a lot of Europeans talk about a strategy for Europe, they have an idea of how to operate in a multipolar world, which simplistically, 5 or 10 years ago, when the concept became very popular, it was sort of very defined as the Europeans do more, the Americans do less, and roughly everything else stays the same. And I think that is a very simplistic view of the world that we all are going to face in 2030. And for a more sort of radical view of that world, I think one of the places you can look is in a report that the National Intelligence Council of the United States came out with that was called, in December of this last year, that was called Global Trends 2030. And I'm going to use that as a starting point, because the Atlantic Council was worked very closely with the NIC in the preparation of that report. And let me give you some of the data and information that comes from that report to give us a sense of just how different the world we're going to look at in the next 10, 15 years is from the world we have today. The NIC concludes that there's likely to be what they call a definitive shift in economic power from west to east and north to south that is going to leave both the United States and the U.S. diminished, even if you take their collective resources together. Between now and 2030, the global middle class is projected to go from 1 billion to 2 billion, in some estimates 3 billion people. And virtually all of that growth is going to come in the developing world. The middle class consumption in North America and Europe is likely to increase only at a rate of 0.6% a year. Asia consumption by the middle class could go as high as increasing at 9% a year. The United States, EU, and Japan will have a combined share of global income that is likely to fall from the current 56% to well under half. And most of the global economic growth over the next 15 years will come from Asia, with China contributing 1/3 of all global economic growth by 2025. And that will come at a huge resource cost. Even now in 2012, China accounted for 46% of the world's steel production and 59% of the global supply of cement. So what does this mean for a global strategy for Europe or for the United States, for that matter? I think we're going to have to be very ambitious as we think about that strategy, and I think we have to be global as we think about that strategy. There's been some good work done about how Europe should talk about, sort of build up its strategy from its strategic neighborhood. I think Europe and the United States also have to build down our strategy up above from thinking about globally. The major challenges we're going to face, Europe and the United States, are global challenge. They are challenges of global phenomenon, whether it's terrorism, proliferation, ensuring adequate supplies of energy, food, and water, the demand for which is going to nearly double in the next 15 years, cyber threats, humanitarian disasters, climate change, refugee flows, huge problems affecting us all. No nation can solve them by themselves. And yet no nation can succeed in their own plans for a peaceful, prosperous future unless these problems are solved. So where do we start? I think one of the things we need to do is for the United States and Europe together, initially, and then in a dialogue with the rest of the players in the international community, need to start asking the fundamental question: what are the new institutions and relationships and modes of interaction we need if we are going to be able to solve these global problems? I think we're at a time very much like the end of the Second World War, where some very visionary people got together and gave us a new set of institutions that provided a basis for peace and prosperity for the next 40 years. I think we're at that kind of time, and I think we need to start thinking institutionally about what do we need for dealing with these problems. Once we've done that together, then I think the question becomes, well, what is the strategy that needs to be pursued within those institutions? And again, I think this is something that the United States and Europe need to be developing together. Because my own view is that neither of us are going to be able to do what we need to do for our citizens in order to live successfully in this world of 2030 unless we pool our resources and pool our influence. The challenges are going to be just too big, and the world is just going to look too differently than it does now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve, I think it's fair to say that none of these numbers that you have given us is a truly shocking number any longer. We've heard them a lot, many times. There are many horizon scanning exercises that give us these general trends. So they're not shocking, but what is shocking is the apparent lack of ambition on behalf of European states, governments, maybe even populations.
And my own government.
And perhaps also the American government, to actually confront these. And right. This is the ambition question is the one that I would like to bring to Minister Bonino, who knows from her time in the European Commission how difficult it is, but also how fruitful it can be when member states bring their ambitions to the EU to do something together. And now you're responsible for Italy's input into that EU machinery, among other things. And so the question is, where does this lack of an ambition come from? Is it only the crisis? Is it an overall lack, if you think of political, strategic thinking in our European countries? Or would you disagree? Is there a lot of ambition to actually maybe go against these trends? Because, this seems to be the kind of currency that we need if we want to realize the trends and do something about them.
No, let me just I will just be back directly to your question. Just with one sentence, you know, I was very much impressed not impressed, but when you said that we must realize that there is no single threats or problems that can be solved by a single nation. And that is exactly was the starting point of the building of Europe. It was not only to make peace from let's say, at the beginning of Europe at the Second World War. And the idea of Europe was born during the war by some visionary people that exactly still during the war were thinking ahead. Maybe this is the kind of ambition you're calling for. But also, I'd like to say that their ambition was not only to make peace among Europeans, but also the concept that in any case, no real problem can be solved by one nation alone. That was the vision 50 years ago. Where do we stand now? And why it is so difficult to have a quote-unquote a European ambition? As you know, I am really a fervent European, even if I do realize that we are not moving forward quick enough in a sort of a more political and integrated Europe. But anyhow, with all the European bashing, which is now so fashionable, let me tell you also that I don't see anywhere in the world, let alone the United States, for a different history, a real project in which 28 nations with a different history, language, culture, have been able to pull together part of their assets and their it's not Mercosur, much more than that. It's not Asian, it's much more than that. So Europe in se is an imperfect but unique project that because it's not easy, you know, to give up your flag, to give up your currency for some people. I mean, I don't belong to the nationalistic approach, but it's not so easy. To pull together, imagine, doesn't happen in Africa, it doesn't happen in Asia, it doesn't happen in Latin America. So with all the European bashing, which is so fashionable these days, and rightly so for some reasons, nevertheless, I do think that the European project is still the only one worthwhile. The only problem is that we should move forward much quicker than we do. On the other end, and it's exactly joining what you said, we have to pull resources and to pull the asset, to pull thinking, to pull, because the world is changing, it's not waiting for us. We cannot say to the world, listen, slow down a little bit, dear Chinese, you are moving too fast. We Europeans are not used to move so fast, so please give us a break. That you can always say, but apparently it doesn't work. So the question is that we should go quicker, which, and Joschka will, I think, will join me and say how difficult it is, and in fact, we are really, during these 2 years, going a little bit backward, in a little bit more on a nationalistic perspective. Even addressing the economic crisis has been done much more at national level than at European level. So the tendency, unfortunately, that we have to fight against is more going backwards than going forward. But I would like to make some hope in this discourse. Maybe starting from some figures that you have been really, rightly so, quoting the figure by 2030. But if we look at the figure where we stand now, still we are moving, and if we want, and if we have the right vision, we are starting from quite an asset. Because if you look at the figure now, in fact, the numbers stress the figures that I have, that American European economies still account for about half of the world GDP now, that the total US investment in Europe is 3 times higher than in all of Asia, that EU investment in the US is around 8 times the amount of EU investment in India and China together, that the combined military budget of the US and European countries and other NATO partners is around 70% of the global total. So just to say that we are starting from a very consolidated and positive presence worldwide. Yes, the power is fragmenting worldwide. Yes, it's moving from west to east, from north to south. But nevertheless, the core, the question is, are we going to dilapidate this asset, or are we going to build on this asset to be partners or actors worldwide? And that is a political decision. It's not a technical decision, it's a political decision. As difficult as you like, but for instance, the new Transatlantic trade agreement, which is giving a lot of a headache to everybody, and et cetera, et cetera. It's not a simple trade agreement. It's much more than that. And the symbolism could be much more than that. And the concrete effects are really a boost in the economy. Yet, from one side and the other, we are still more than cautious. You don't want the procurement inside the trade agreement. Some of us don't want the cultural exception. The other one doesn't want I don't know what. And we do not want. That means simply that maybe we lack the vision, which is absolutely needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you gave some more positive numbers. When we had this discussion just briefly upstairs there, Joschka Fischer was very beautifully pessimistic about all of this. He said it's not only a lack of ambition, it's a lack of recognition that these things are actually happening. So the Europeans are just sleepwalking into disaster. Is that basically your point, Joschka?
Well, at least the Economist had the headline, "The Sleepwalkers," and showed well-known leading European elected politicians. And in a certain way, I agree to that, that the EU is in a kind of sleepwalking. And it's not about pessimism. I mean, in such conferences like that, usually you try to spread optimism, saying nice things, and so on. But I think the situation is serious because the world is changing very fast. It was described by figures from Steve Hadley. It's not a situation where we should be pessimistic but realistic. We should wake up and not allow sleepwalking, allow us sleepwalking into the future. Things can be done, but this needs, I think, a very realistic analysis. And looking to the United States and to Europe, I see a certain imbalance addressing the future issues. The United States has big problems, as others, and is in a relative decline, relative because others will rise. But I believe the United States will, with a lot of noise and some irrationalities, fix their problems and be prepared for the 21st century. But this means a reduced role of the Atlantic and an increased role of the Pacific Rim, because there is the potential strategic rivalry, there are the major creditors, there are the future big markets with huge potential of growth and businesses. All in all, America is also internally changing. It will be less European, more Asian, more Latin American. In the future, Latin America will play an increased role, and the limited resources on power of the United States will lead the United States to certain priorities. And I guess that if the Europeans continue in the way as we are doing it now, Europe and our very complicated neighborhood, our very complicated environment, will be reduced in the priority, in the agenda of the priorities of the United States, which would be very bad. I'm not in favor for that. So this imbalance, if we want to counter this imbalance, it needs a very realistic analysis where Europe is nowadays. And looking from a strategic point of view, first of all, I don't see that the Europeans are thinking strategically. So it's nice in a conference to talk about common strategies, but watching very carefully what's going on in Brussels and in relevant capitals. By and then there is a strategic concern, but all in all, I don't see that. For example, Ukraine, with the exception of Poland and some other new member states in Central Eastern Europe, I don't see that the Europeans are aware about the importance of Ukraine for the post-Cold War, Europe. I don't see that in Brussels. Unfortunately, I don't see that in the United States, in DC. But I think this is a European challenge, and our strategic situation will be changed. If the Ukraine will move to the east, this will be a different Europe from the post-war Europe. Do we like that? Is that in our interest? These are questions which must then be transformed into common action. I don't see that. I don't see common action when I'm looking to the southeast. Yes, Croatia will join, but what will be the future of enlargement policy? One of the most powerful tools of the European Union. There's a lot of frustration, tiredness, and now we see in Turkey, which is all in all a great success story also for European enlargement policy, because without the input of Europe, once Turkey was a candidate, all the constitutional reforms in Turkey wouldn't have happened, or at least wouldn't have happened in the dimension and in the speed it happened. But in the same time, the Europeans slapped the door into the face of Turkey at the mid of the decade. And since then, Turkey is moving successfully forward, but alone. And what we see now is that a very successful Erdogan government is making mistakes. So I think we should really reconsider what is the future of our relationship to Turkey. And I'm still in favor to keep the door open, not only theoretically, but practically. Because if we keep Turkey alone, we will lose one of the biggest assets in the crisis region, which will inflict us. And it's not only the Middle East, it's also the Caspian region, the Caucasian region. So from that point of view, it needs bold decisions and a strategic thinking. And if you look to the Middle East, it will be not exclusively our problem, but Europe's security will be defined there. The Middle East is unraveling in its existing order. The genie is out of the bottle, you can't bring them back. Means Syria the beginning of a disintegration, of a chaotic disintegration of the old Middle East, of the Sykes-Picot Middle East. What will happen to Egypt? Is the present government capable to address also the economic issues? Same in Tunisia. We have the terrorist threat, which will not go away. So from that point of view, are the Europeans ready to address these issues? Do we have the hardware to address these issues? These are the relevant questions in a realistic analysis. And the last question is, can we do that in the existing structure? I think no. If Europe will stay disunited in a kind of confederation named EU, I think enlargement policy will be seriously threatened, and I think strategic action, analysis, will not take place or will only take place as piecemeal, but not in a very efficient way. So to sum up all this, I think if we are interested in a strong alliance with the United States and Canada, in a strong North Atlantic alliance, not only militarily, but also economically, and I fully support this idea of a transatlantic trade agreement, then it's a question up to us. Are we ready to move forward? Not only to overcome the present crisis, the financial crisis, but are we ready to say farewell to the 20th and 19th century and move into a real integration? That's the key question. Otherwise, it will be nice words if this will not happen, but not serious action, and serious action is needed.
Thank you very much. That makes for wonderful, wonderful strategic constipation in Europe, I guess. if you put all of that together. But thank God we have the Americans, right? I mean, they've always helped us out. Mr. Sikorski, you have been one of the driving forces to kind of provide a remedy for that strategic constipation in Europe, that absence of strategic thinking. Personally, but also as one of the curators, if you will, of that European global strategy process that was happening over the last few months. Now, do the Europeans have the will? Do Europeans have the appetite and the ambition? And do they have not only the hardware, but also the heart to do it? Because it takes a leap of faith, also some faith in yourself, right?
Well, that's quite a question. Wonderful to be on this panel. Very good to see Steve Hadley again, with whom we had a good sparring over the missile defense, and from which I hope on both sides we are friends that respect each other. He's also done very important work on sub-strategic nuclear issues, which is also unfinished business across the Atlantic. I have a collection of figures that are as scary as the ones you've cited. How about this one? In 40 to 50 years, Germany's population will shrink by 13 million, while global population will be on the rise. Germany's share in the global GDP will fall from the current 4% to 2%. And the same economic trends apply to France and Great Britain. In less than 50 years, the big three's share in the world's GDP will be a mere 6%, half of what it is today. What's more, in 2050, no single European country will be among the top 10 world economies. But I wonder, you know, all these statistics are essentially projections of current trends. And I'm not sure that history is linear. If you look at the last 100 years and you took the history of Europe in 20 or even 10-year slices, at each of those points you couldn't predict what the world would be like in the next 20 years. So I suspect something that we don't anticipate will happen. I was just in China last year, and its development of China, of course, is extraordinarily impressive. But I'm also told that there are huge debts accumulated in the Chinese banking system, and that this kind of investment-driven expansion usually ends in a debt crisis. So I expect China to slow down a little bit, to consolidate the admittedly very powerful position that she's found herself in. Now, are we capable of thinking strategically in Europe? I think as regards thinking, it's not too bad. We have wonderful strategies. We have, the current think tank strategy. We have the current official European strategy. We have wonderful strategies towards our strategic partners. Under the German presidency, a strategy towards Russia, for example, with modernization, holistically understood, democracy, think tanks, rule of law, all the beautiful things. There is one problem with all these strategies. The Lisbon strategy. Europe, the most innovative, the most competitive area of the world, that they have not all been fully implemented yet.
It's a friendly way of saying it.
Right.
Fully what?
Implement.
Right.
The I word.
And so what I'm worried about is not whether we can think strategically, but whether we can act strategically. And in which areas we can act strategically in partnership with the United States. Because economies of scale apply across the Atlantic just as much as they apply in Europe. And there are basically two areas: security and trade. On security, we all know how much money Europe wastes, how much it would make sense to have a stronger European defense posture. And we also all know how difficult it is. We are putting great hopes on the Italian presidency. But we know that European defense is very difficult to do without the British. And the British, for their own internal reasons, find it hard to embrace European defense as the next big integration project. Even though when for example, sanctions work on Iran, I think the British should see this as a multiplier for what they themselves try to achieve. Because the multi-annual financial framework that we've just agreed, we negotiated in the midst of a horrible crisis, we were unable to expand the budget to include defense matters, which are costly. On the contrary, we've actually reduced funding till the end of the decade on issues to do with foreign affairs and security. So whereas I hope that the December European Council will come up with some substance, and I'm hoping on the External Action Service to present a good set of proposals within a month or so, and I'm hoping on Emma's fertile brain and Italian influence. It's not looking too good in the sense that I don't see Europe really standing on its 2 feet as regards defense in the next few years. That leaves trade. And as Emma has already hinted at, the potential here is enormous. Let me add some figures. We are top investment partners for each other. The aggregated value of FDIs in 2011 across US and Europe is 3.7 trillion. And if we were to reach the agreement that is currently discussed, we could generate additional 0.5% of growth in the EU and 0.4 growth of GDP each year in the US. That would translate into 800,000 new jobs in the US and 1.5 million new jobs in the European Union, which is something we need very badly. We seem to be finally, hopefully, maybe, reaching the end of the crisis. I'm very concerned that we shouldn't waste the crisis. This crisis should not be allowed to go to waste. And so if we are sufficiently scared on both sides of the Atlantic, then we should do this deal. And so what I'm counting on is that our negotiators should very quickly identify the areas where we have political problems on both sides of the Atlantic. It'll be agriculture guaranteed on both sides of the Atlantic. It'll be the fundamentally important issue of the way you clean dead chickens, because you clean them with some substances that are not allowed in Europe. The audiovisual stuff, GMOs, and so on. And I think this is going to be the test. Can we then make some real sacrifices for the sake of making this deal, or will we be hamstrung by domestic constituencies that will just say no? And here I come to what Joschka said about Ukraine. We've offered an association agreement to Ukraine. We are still not sure whether we'll sign it, whether Ukraine will be ready, of course. But the agreement with its trade part, which hopefully would apply immediately, has some good things in it, mostly for the EU, quite frankly, and it needs some sacrifices. And in this part of the world, we are used to it. When we were offered our association agreement in the 1990s, it was supposed to be skewed towards us. We could export as many satellites and semiconductors, everything that we were not actually producing, to the EU as much as we can. And it meant a really nasty adjustment in whole sectors of our economy, which we just bit the bullet and did. So this is the test. We now have, as Transatlantic, a set of politicians on both sides of the Atlantic as can be expected. And I think a time when we should realize the consequences of not conducting the deal. And what I can pledge to you is that Poland and that this region, because we do think strategically, will be in favor of acting strategically. We are already being lobbied. We are already formulating a difficult mandate for the negotiation. And I just hope we achieve one for the European Commission with the view of concluding it. And then hopefully the answer will be yes. Thank you.
You've just singled out trade and defense security as the two main playing fields, really, in the transatlantic agenda, if you will. Steve Hadley, I think, identified a much wider array of issues, really the global governance questions of IMF and World Bank, the United Nations, G20, potentially, these kinds of things. And he said initially it must be the United States and Europe who provide new models and new ideas for institutions, new rules, and then in engagement with the rest of the planet must make that the norm, if you will. That is even huger than just trade and defense are already enormous. If we do have a problem with acting strategically, even on the small construction sites, how can we then go up to the Steve Hadley level of ambition and act strategically there?
Well, here I'm not sure I completely agree because I'm not sure, I don't think we have a shortage of institutions. We just have institutions that atrophy. What we need is to inject will into the institutions that we've created. And in some institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF, we simply have to make more room for the aspirant countries so that they become satisfied with their stakes and inject new energy into them. Because the alternative is for them to atrophy, and then they will create their own institutions and invite us to join theirs. And this is what calls for bold leadership, because it's very difficult always to accommodate rising powers.
I'm not so sure. Sorry. Not so sure it's only like that. Because take the board and the voting rights in the IMF or the World Bank. It's crystal clear that the voting rights in the board are not corresponding to the real weight of the outside world. But again, who is giving up? Who should give up? Who should make room for the others? Who decides who makes room for the others? So we are back to the fact that maybe you don't need new institutions, but definitely you need a different decision-making process or somebody who puts some order, again, to begin with, in Europe. Because the presence in the voting rights in IMF or the World Bank is mostly a question of over-European representation. And if you want to get others in, somebody has to get out.
But the voting rights, you're right, they're not corresponding to the weight of the world,
Yeah,
but they're corresponding roughly to what countries actually put into these funds,
exactly.
Right?
So the question is that the budget or the policy is not exactly looking at the world outside, is representing who is putting the money. So maybe it's not the right balance to make a good policy, evidently. On the other hand, I was much younger when I heard at the beginning that the need to reform the Security Council. And I think I will get older and older exactly with the same dossier. And nothing more or less will happen, and we will continue pretending that it's not effective, or et cetera, but we'll stay like there. So again, in some way, you can push people to think strategically. But in democratic country, then you have to, how you push them to act strategically, because from time to time, you have to be elected. And it's also full of honor to lose election for the good cause. Depends, but the real ambition would be to win the election with the good cause, which is not exactly automatic. For instance, again, I want to pick on strategic Europe and the lack of European strategic acting. Turkey. Nowadays, these days, everybody is discussing, and superficially so, most of the time, on what is happening in Turkey. And I keep repeating that Taksim is not Tahrir, even less Tiananmen, simply because Turkey, like it or not, is a democracy. It's a more and more paternalistic democracy, but it's a democracy. Nevertheless, whatever the responsibility of Turkey, European responsibility is that we slapped the door to Turkey, and we stopped the negotiation, basically, losing any kind of credibility on pacta sunt servanda, and if our asset or soft power is also credibility, we lost it. Now, well, it's very good to teach and preach to Erdogan or whatsoever, but the fact is that even more now, there are people who want to close the door to Turkey forever. There are others in Europe, like me, who are saying, no, this is the moment in which we have to open up the doors and maybe to recover the time that we have been wasting. Again, is there a difference of strategy? Not so much. It's a difference of acting. Because in all, if you look at 2030, even the most opponents to Turkey will say, yes, they are part of the European family. Yes, we have to keep them together. Yes, yes, yes. But the no comes in, what do we do now? How do we act now to fulfill our strategy for the future? So the contradiction is there.
You've picked Turkey issue
Turkey
now. Let's pick another one that hurts, kind of. And I want to ask you the question, because I don't want to ask a German, an American, or a Pole, and it is Russia. All of the horrible numbers that we heard from Steve apply to Russia, but even more so. Basically, most of the indicators for Russia are all the way going down. And yet, we're turning this into a strategic issue of a major kind of size. You know, it's the big unresolved issue of the post-Cold War order in Europe. Some people say no, it's a power in decline, don't worry too much about them. You know, the Europeans obviously don't get a grasp strategically, neither in thinking nor acting on Russia. Would you agree or disagree?
I don't think they don't think strategically. I think we are back to the dossier in which then it's very difficult to act strategically. So I think we are back to the same contradiction. Whatever you think, and on Russia, Russia is our neighbors, Russia is next door, Russia is part of Europe, Russia is whatever you want. But the question then remains, and then, having said that, what do you do with Russia? And where European splits is on what to do today, tomorrow, next month on Russia. It's not, let's say, the broader picture, which is far away to be controversial. What it becomes controversial is the daily policy. But I think Joschka is even more experienced, as I am, on the European Council on the split on Russia.
I wanted to go to Joschka anyways, because I want to ask him about another country that actually hurts, and that is Germany. Germany is the big strategic vacuum.
Poor one.
Poor one, you know, I can't spare him that. It's the big strategic vacuum in Europe, really. And it's the swing country in Europe, if you will. If they come around strategically, then there's hope. If not, then we just have the status quo or something even worse. I know that you're critical of the current government, but beyond that, I mean, what is Germany, you know, what is driving Germany? Where is the ambition? Or is there some and we don't know about it?
Allow me to start from a different angle. Listening to this debate, We started with global trends which are dramatic, historical, because it will end a European/American dominated world during our lifespan, even during my lifespan. And I'm an old man in the meanwhile. So, and we ended up in a typical balance of power European discussion. Who is dominating? I understand that, I'm a European too. So we have it in our genes. First of all, Europe is important for the world. But we are living now in a time where we will lose that. And we can accelerate it or we can act in a wise way. But it will happen. It's not up to us. It will happen. But we are still thinking we are the center of the world. And therefore, who dominates Europe is the real question. It's not any longer. If the Europeans are not able to overcome this way of thinking, we will defeat ourselves. Very simple. And it's obvious. I mean, there are no Brits and no French here in the room, so I can speak freely. How long do you believe Europe can block the reform of the Security Council? There are some others who will block it, but one day, one early day, the rest of the world, including our American friends, with all our strategic relationship, will tell us, look,
It's over.
it makes no sense that you have 2 permanent and 3 or 5 non-permanent seats. America has one, Russia has one, China has one, India will become one, an African will become one. So there is a European permanent seat. You have to figure out how you will manage that. Call us when you have an agreement. Until then, this seat will be empty. Sorry for you Europeans. But the 19th and 20th century is over. And they are right. And what makes me sick is these kind of discussions, to see the trends, to know what will happen, and then these boring 19th, 20th century European debate about who dominates. None of us will dominate. And Germany now is in a stronger position, but we have been in a very weak position. I was in the government. And others were celebrating a big party in Western Europe. Poland was also for many years in a very complicated situation, is doing today excellently. But we know as experienced people that this is an up and down, and we have to prepare not for the sunshine. If the sun is shining, everything is fine, government is happy, because they win elections, whether they deserve it or not, and everything is going well. But during the sunshine, you have to prepare for more challenging, for a more challenging political weather, and that's exactly what we are not doing. Minister Sikorski is fully right. We have a dramatic lack of practice, and I would add, we don't have the will to act, because we have to overcome some institutional blocks. And the most important block is that the crisis will force us to the question, will we stick together at any price? Yes or no? If not, it will be a different Europe. And we shouldn't blame the Russia that they are playing Divide et Impera. Russia is much weaker than the EU, but we are divided. Russia is united. That's the difference.
Well, united. Russia is one.
Yeah, united.
It's easy to be united when you are one.
It's one.
You can be surprisingly disunited,
That's
even
exactly
if
what
you're
I'm
only
talking
one.
about.
I think,
And therefore, allow me one sentence to Germany.
Yes.
Don't expect that, especially strategic action or strategic leadership, if you like, will come from Germany. And this is not only a question of the present coalition. It won't change if the opposition will take over, what I don't believe. I deeply regret it, but I don't believe in this. So from that point of view, I think we have some challenging years ahead. because looking to France or to others, maybe Italy will
Steve wanted to
bring
comment,
us the light, but I'm not very optimistic about a new strategic sense. I won't say thinking, but sense. It means to understand the issues and then have proper action in Europe.
All right, Steve, you are already...
I was just going to come back to sort of close the institutional discussion. I thought your riff on the UN Security Council was a very good one. And the point I'm making is I think institutions have to change and adapt to these new circumstances. And what I'm arguing is the United States and Europe should get out ahead of it and lead the process, not just become the victims of the process. Minister Sikorski is right. Some of the institutions, it's just a matter of modifications and change. My guess is that we'll need some new institutions, but the world is changing such that if we do not lead and are part of that process of adapting institutions, other players have the option, as you said, of going out and establishing their own. And you know, an Asia that is knit together in trade and other respects without America or Europe is a pretty formidable Asia. So I think it is necessary for us to do so, but there's a second, as a practical matter, but there's a second reason to do it, and that is, in a way, a much more psychological one. We are long-standing allies. We, the United States and Europe, are bound together by common values. The world will be much better for each of us if those values are propounded and embraced by the world. And so there is an advantage for us to be working together, and I think it is important for psychological reasons that our two peoples see Europe and the United States working together on common problems that matter, that it in some sense reaffirms to a next generation of Americans and Europeans the importance of that relationship. I think it's important practically, but I also think it's psychologically important for reaffirming, if you will, between our two peoples, this very important bond.
Mr. Sikorski, I think you wanted to...
Well, I just find it gratifying that to hear from Joschka that we agree on the fact that Europe should have a permanent seat on the Security Council, which I think was your government's policy, which unfortunately has been changed. Poland certainly will not support increasing the overrepresentation of Western Europe at the UN. We should go the other way. But I wanted to come back to Russia and our policy towards Russia, because I'm actually more optimistic than some of you. Not because we can influence what Russia does. It's actually notoriously difficult in foreign policy to make another sovereign state do what it doesn't want to do. Countries act according to their own cultural DNA and their own domestic makeup. And Russia certainly is a traumatized country. I think I was following the debate on Twitter and earlier today, and the parallel with Turkey seems to be apt. But what we can as politicians do is what we ourselves control. And there are important things that we control in Europe. I would put to you that the guys who are actually doing policy on Russia are the boys from DG Energy and DG Competition in Brussels. And what they are doing is really significant. When 8 years ago, successive Polish governments were talking about energy security, we were dismissed as scaremongers. Today, EU is doing what we were suggesting at that time. We are actually building physical interconnectors between gas systems. We are unbundling the ownership of gas upstream from distribution services. and the ownership of gas pipelines from the management of the pipelines. We are implementing the principle of third-party access. I think the take-or-pay principle will soon be banned. And therefore, there will be, I think, by the end of the decade, if we don't stray, we will have a competitive, integrated gas market in Europe. That will have an effect on Russia. That will mean that Russia will have to become more like Norway. And it will be enormously beneficial for Russia herself. Russia will still be able to make a lot of money out of the export of carbohydrates, but will have to behave in a much more competitive way. That will be a huge achievement for Europe, for our strategy, for the European consumer, but in the long run, I think also for the Russian people.
All right, thank you very much.